Hello and welcome to this video on Gloc, a clock generator, divider, multiplier and probability and rhythm masking Eurorack module from Instruo. Here's what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Instruo. Gloc means clock in Scottish Gaelic, fitting for its function as a clock generator and clock modulator. The module is 4 HP and has 7 outputs that can be spread in time between multiplications and divisions. You can add random probability or set rhythmic probability masking, both of which you can modulate, and there's a smart and intuitive program mode to lock the state of different outputs. So you can be really heavy-handed and playful with modulating your rhythms while keeping other outputs steady. There's also a tap tempo button, which has Instruo's tempo smoothing and following built in, which is helpful if you're working with live playing, needing to follow a human drifting or changing clock source. Running down the panel here, here's our 7 outputs, all of which have an LED to show their activity. The middle output is always your quarter note, and the top 3 outputs above it will multiply, and the bottom 3 outputs will divide. The tempo is set either with the tap tempo button or the incoming clock, and there's a reset too for resetting divisions and your probability masked rhythms. You control the multiplication and division of the clock with the spread control on the top of the module. Fully counterclockwise, every output is the same and outputs a quarter note, and as you increase the level, you increase the multiplication and division factors across those outputs. Here's a graphic from the manual that shows how those outputs change across that control. And the input directly under that trim pot is a CV control for spread, which adds to the pot value. Under the spread control we have probability, and this is a bipolar control, where in the centre it's 100% probability, so all the clocks fire regularly, nothing is skipped or changed. Going counterclockwise, we go from 100% all the way down to 0% probability in the expected random way, which is skipping clock pulses and skipping more of them with a higher setting there. Then from centre going clockwise, turning to the right, this is a series of density mask rhythms, which can be thought of as a series of looping 8-step sequences and rests. Like random probability, they carve into the clock stream, but in this case with a repetitive and musical rhythm applied. Probability also has a CV input which will add to that pot value too. The bottom pot is then a PWM gate length control, handy for fine-tuning how envelopes or logic modules respond to these clocks, or for slimming the pulses right down to something thin like a trigger to strike things like low-pass gates. There's then a really simple and intuitive program mode and a freeway switch to work with setting up the module. With the switch to the left, you enter program mode, and you use the PWM knob or output select knob to select an output. You can see the LED move to show which is selected, and simply tapping the button will change the orange, and this enters these outputs into a locked state. As we go back into the middle, we're in the regular mode, and now any changes that we make won't apply to those locked outputs. So I could increase the spread, lower probability, and we still have our locked states that were locked at the settings that were set when I locked them. There's also a third mode here, which is live mode, and that's a switch all the way to the right, and that ignores all locked states, and all the outputs will follow these panel settings or the CV modulation of them. So you can go into program mode, simply select an output, lock it in a state that you're happy with, a spread and a probability that you like, play with it regularly, modulate your other clocks while keeping some steady and locked, or going into that live mode to change them, and you can use that switch performatively to switch in and out of different states on the module. As usual for Instruo, they're packing a lot of functionality in, but it's a performable and simple to use module that's been lots of fun for beats, sequences and melodies. There's lots of patches to come, those are on screen and in the description down below, so skip around and let's dive in. So here's my first patch with Gloc, and I just wanted to explore some kind of basic beat making, and it's led to this kind of washed out broken beat. In the background, if I mute everything to do with the beat, I have the TSL through Manic, controlled by this octone and a droid envelope, into a big effects aid reverb. And it's this octone at this rate you're hearing that is my clock input, and also a reset from step 1 into Gloc. So this is driving the patch. Now that's kind of secondary to everything else, so I'll mute it. And let's just listen to the kind of core rhythms, green, blue, pink and yellow traces with green, purple, red and yellow cables here. And we've got probability masking from this mid control. And that's a set, steady rhythm, it's not random probability. And we've got the spread of the divisions and multiplications. And if I center this back to just playing the multiplications and divisions, this is your kind of typical clock divider beat. If I bring this, we can just put everything on the same pulse, and then as we spread, we have a range of these multiplications and divisions, and I like it for this particular patch in the middle. Now with this middle control we have probability, standard kind of random probability to the left, going anti-clockwise. So this will randomly just skip. It introduces a probability that these gates won't fire. As I increase, larger probability that the gates won't fire right across all outputs there. And you can go super sparse. Oh, hello, there we go again. So back to the middle just to hear our center rhythm again. And then clockwise from center, we have probability masking, which works into rhythmic work that repeats, kind of preset rhythms if you like. So this carves into these steady clock streams or mults and divisions of the clock, but provides something repetitive. And although this is heavily carved into, you will notice a pattern emerge here. Now if I bring in the other outputs here one by one, we have this divided down cone and 2 extra hi-hats. To work in some rhythms. I bring in my sequence back in just to close off this patch. Let's spread the envelope out here, bliss out the reverb even longer, more probability masking. And that's a quick, my literal first patch, quick look at kind of probability masking and spread Gloc patterns for beats. So here's a fun patch using Gloc for the melody, well, everything but the drums, the melody, bass, and the 3 different layers of synth patterns here. The drums are just external backing here, I'll mute them in my mixer, and we have a mixture of a bass pattern, just a quarter note into some effects, and then the main most playful rhythmic line which is driven by these multiplication outs here on Gloc. Now if I mute everything, turn down some effects and open up a VCA here, I have this pitch sequence playing, coming into the TSL. The actual pitch sequencing is coming from an external module, and I'm running that into a VCA that's then clocked with quarter notes. It's this quarter note pulse that is the actual clock input to Gloc here, and I have a reset at the beginning of the bar as well. So this sound is nothing to do with Gloc, it's just the clock into Gloc and into some effects. It's just serving as a nice ambient kind of pulse here. The bass is simply driven from this output here with the purple cable. It's the first divided output. And that's because I have a sub here on the TSL, so I can animate the sub separately to the rest of the pattern that's going on. We're going to the main layer here. This is all driven by Gloc. As I say, it's the quarter note clock that we heard coming in here. I'm then taking the first multiplied output, blue cable and blue trace, to drive this octone. You can see that rhythm here, and that's driving this sequencing. Now the actual sequence, the CV this generates, is the red trace and cable here, and that comes in to control this spread of divisions and multiplications. So I'm multiplying the clock to drive a sequencer that's then modulating the multiplication of the clock. And that's why you can see this dance around in different rhythms, kind of speeding up and slowing down. And it's the next multiplication up, the yellow trace and cable here, that's striking my envelopes. So it's moving faster than the driving of those changes there. I also have a quarter note clock that is the Gloc clock, and the one that's driving this pulse again. That also drives the other octone in this system, and that comes in here and actually modulates the probability masking. If I remove it, and we just center that control, we have a much simpler going on here. And it's all very interactive because how I set this probability and how I modulate it will also affect the driving of the sequence. And that's this interactivity here. I modulate the multiplication from this one, I modulate the probability from the other octone just off screen, and we get this really lovely kind of rhythmically playful pattern happening. Bringing in the bass again, that is driven from this divided output here. And because there's some probability, this doesn't play steadily on every division, and the division changes because that's modulated. Bringing my other sound here on quarter notes with the effects. So one pitch sequence, a main quarter note clock here, and then other sequences to drive interactive changes through Gloc. Drums back in. So here we're sequencing without a sequencer, and by decoupling rhythm and pitch, we have a really playful, very kind of modular melody generator. I'm using modulation as a source for pitch. It's this ramp wave here. It's a little bit steppy from the source that it's coming from. That's coming into a quantizer. Gloc is clocked from this blue trace here. Red trace is the output. I'm using the highest multiplied output here, with some probability masking and triggering when to quantize a note from this LFO. The LFO is clocked, and therefore we're getting a nice evolving sequence, which is this yellow trace controlling the pitch of my oscillator. I have a sub out of my oscillator that's animated with a divided output here, just for little low end kind of bumps in the mix. Now if I lose the probability here, now if I go to say a 5-step LFO relative to the clocking in this patch, we start to get arpeggio-like patterns. But as I start to mask this with probability patterns, our faster regular LFO becomes a very different sequence. Let's try less probability masking. And leaving Gloc as it is, I'll change this to say a 7-step LFO in cycle length. So I'm playing around with clocked modulation sources, the probability here, to drive evolving but musical and repeating patterns between the clocked modulation source and the probability and multiplication on Gloc. It's a very interactive, very modular approach to melody generation, all by sequencing without a sequencer. So here's a really fun patch that's kind of a big fat slab of techno, where I'm going to use sequenced probability changes, almost like a scene change or a pattern change. And that's going from the full open kind of clocks here that aren't in any way masked in rhythm. And as I change the probability, it's like shifting through patterns of a sequencer. So outside of Gloc as a constant in the patch, I have a kick drum and offbeat hi-hat that just play constantly. Now muting those and the offbeat hi-hat for now. The rest of my rhythms come from Gloc. And if I go to this 0 volt setting or step on the sequencer, this is no change, no modulation of the probability, so it's in the middle, just playing the straight clocks. But then as I modulate into the probability masking, I can change these rhythms. With the full 5 volt step here, giving the sparsest or less dense rhythm out of them all. Let's just hear those over the kick and hi-hat. Full clocks, where they play every single clock division or multiplication. And then differing rhythms. As I say, it's almost like recalling a preset rhythm or a different step or pattern in a sequence. Bringing in some effects, which is just the echo cinematic, feedback up full and me ragging around delay time. No probability change. Drop into a less dense pattern and bring in the kick in. So try sequencing probability, which I've actually got set up as well. Let's clock this. So again, removing everything but the Gloc controlled percussion. I have a divided output controlling the sequencing. And this is self-influencing because as I change the probability with this sequencer, there's less probability that the divided output will fire to actually clock to the next sequencer step. Kick and hat back in. We'll bring in some of this weird feedback effect thing I'm doing. Kick back in. Good fun. So here we're exploring some self-patched feedback-based rhythms. And it's this kind of playful, interactive, shifting bass pattern that Gloc is controlling. In the background, I have a drum beat. This is just some sonic set dressing, just to give it a beat. I'll mute it for now. And I have the TSL here. I just knocked the tuning, playing a 16th note 5-note arpeggio pattern. This just sets the pulse and it's a 16th note from my sequencer, and then I have Gloc controlling the sub and how the sub is animated in a filter. If I remove the self-patching for now, set probability back to center, you can hear that I've set up this multiplication, the yellow cable, which is controlling the envelope for the bass, just to mirror the 16th note from my sequencer. We can spread that. I'm just going to leave that in the middle, and of course we can add probability, either random or masked rhythms. But I'm patching out the first divided output here, which is the blue trace, and patching that back in to the spread of divisions and multiplications. But what's interesting and why this is feedback is that by doing that, I'm not just speeding up this multiplication, the yellow trace and cable here, we're actually changing the spread of the divisions, and it's the divided out here that is this blue trace. So by patching in here, we're affecting itself, i.e. feedback. If I add another layer of feedback here, if I take the quarter note output and say patch this into probability, and let's add a little bit of probability to kind of start things off here. You can see it doesn't always fire. Again, self-patched feedback. The thing that's controlling the change in probability changes the probability of itself. So you end up in this probability that the other outputs will change and the probability of probability changing. Feedback. And with the beat one last time. So try self-patching anywhere that you can play with rhythms, clocks, divisions, probability. It's led to this interesting playful rhythm in the bass here. So here we'll explore the program mode and the ability to lock the state of certain outputs. Here's a patch where I'm driving a beat and an octone here, giving me my pitch sequence and main rhythm. And of course, as you've seen throughout the video, if I start to change the spread and probability, this is affecting all the outputs, but we can change the behavior here so we can lock the state of some outputs and then be playful and modulate and perform with the others. Putting this back to how I wanted it, we simply use the switch here to the left, which goes into the settings mode, and your gate length or PWM knob will then select an output. I'm hoping you can see this on camera. And you simply toggle the button to change this LED to be orange. Let's do the kick and snare drum there. And that's locked their state as it's set. So as I change this, going back to regular mode with the switch in the middle, let's do a high probability. That kick and snare is locked, it's not changing. So let's just be playful with the hi-hats. If I go back into settings mode and scroll up to my purple cables here, the clock and the reset for the octone. Now I go back to regular mode. If I slow everything down, it's only my hi-hats and cymbals, or if I speed them up, change the probability, I have this locked state. But there's an interesting third position on this switch, which is live mode, and that will ignore the locked states and take everything to those panel settings. So we'll lose our locked kick snare and driving of the octone here. that probability is now applied to everything. Back to regular mode in the middle. And let's set this up so it's only the kick that is locked. So again, left on the settings control, bottom pot to select. And I'll unlock everything but the kick. Regular mode. Adding a probability mask. My locked kick is staying active, but as I switch to live mode, this probability mask applies to the kick, it ignores that locked state. Really interesting for performing with a patch where you can really strip back the whole behaviour of the system. Then bring in something regular and locked like the kick drum there. And then use the controls or modulation to bring you back into a state that you're happy with or performing with again. So here's a quick patch just to look at how pulse width or the gate length will affect things like ADSRs. We'll also look at using it with Logic in a moment too. So here's a density or probability masked rhythm. Green trace here is this pulse, and that's the envelope that's controlling. Let's just go to a steady clock and a slower rhythm here. This purple output is driving pitch sequences on my sequencer. And you can see the ADSR shape really clearly. If we close off the pulse width, going left from center counterclockwise, this pulse gets thinner. And let's remove all my effects here. So you can see how we can really play around with the length of this envelope in terms of the sustain portion of an ADSR. Doing this on the faster rhythm. Let's mask this rhythm again. So that's just a really quick look at the pulse width or gate length control. So here we're again looking at PWM or pulse width or gate length for these outputs. The rhythms here, red, blue, yellow, green traces as usual for the scope and cables, are driving EAS, a Logic module from Instruo. If you'd like to learn about Logic and its usefulness in modular systems, I'll link that demo down below. Everything you're hearing comes out of the Logic module and is driven by Gloc's outputs. The only one you're not seeing is the little plucky melody, which is playing on the quarter note here, purple cables, into a NOT gate. Now just listen as I change this pulse width to thinner pulses, you'll see them change, and you'll hear these rhythms go rather wonky. Let's go thinner. Let's speed up the multiplications, slow down the divisions with more spread. Add some probability masking. Thinner pulses again. So a quick exploration of gate length for driving rhythms through a Logic module. So here's some fun driving two sequencers for a kind of dueling melody, dueling sequencer patch. If I mute one of the sounds, the first multiplied output green trace here drives the left-hand octone sequencer, which is pitch sequencing the psych and controlling the envelopes for it. That's panned slightly left. If I then unmute the other sound, the second multiplication output that's faster, red trace here, is driving this yellow sequence from the right-hand octone into the TSL, and that's panned slightly right. Back together again. And this is really just kind of a love letter to clock division and probability. It's such a fun and powerful thing to play with, If I go back to steady clocks, let's slow down these multiplications by lowering the spread. And let's just do random probability to the left here. And we're getting kind of chordal, nice intervals happening. Mainly nice because of the note choices on the sequences. Let's lower that probability even more, but go back to the faster clock multiplication. And if this is too random, you can of course lose all probability and use the masking to the right hand side as I was at the start. For something repetitive, and there's lots of rhythms to be found in here. I could keep going with this kind of dueling melody all day. And try driving sequences to create kind of opposing but complementary dueling melodies. If you've got this far in the video, drop a clock sync down in the comments. You can support me on patreon.com/DivKid. Hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!